Hello and welcome everyone to this exciting new series. Again, I'm Holly. I'm an infrastructure cloud architect focused on Azure networking. I want to thank again all our presenters from our cross-functional teams for sharing their different perspectives on the RAG use case. And thank you to all our moderators for supporting this event. A special shout out to David O'Keefe for bringing the holistic CTO perspective to the series. And I'll be bringing infrastructure eyes, right? So let's bridge it all together from a secure networking perspective. So if you have been on my previous session, this screen that I'm sharing would look familiar to you. Basically, what you see is a Draw.io tool that I'm using to build reusable and layered architectures to run efficiently in a design session. And again, we'll keep a growth mindset. So if a new feature gets rolled out, or if we figure out there's a better way, a more optimal way to design something, we'll update the layers in a GitHub friendly way. So be sure to check out the previous sessions for details on reusable design. Let's dive right into the AI Studio networking content. So just as a reminder, AI Studio is in preview, so just be aware of that. So let me go over what you see on my screen is a classic hub spoke architecture. The blue box is hub. I haven't shown the spokes in here, but blue box is the hub. Yellow box is the on-prem connectivity provided using ExpressRoute or any sort of private connectivity, site-to-site VPN. And the green box up at the top is any PaaS services, the services that Mike talked about, AI search and storage. So this is, think of this as an existing presence, customer's presence in Azure. Now let's introduce AI Studio. So when you provision AI Studio, it provisions a lot of PaaS services behind the scenes. As you can see, green box here again is all the PaaS services that get provisioned. So you can see a container registry, key vault, storage, blob, all of these get provisioned. So I'm going to take a brief moment to share the portal screen just so you can see the different components, and I'll come back to the Draw IO in a second. So let me share my screen. All right. So here I have the Azure AI Studio already provisioned. So when you go to the Azure AI Studio, from a networking perspective, if you click on this tab, it shows you three different options to configure it. So public access out of the box. If you provision, let me go to this option first. There are three different ways to provision AI Studio. One is the public access, the one that Melody demoed earlier. And then there are two other options, which says allow internet outbound and allow approved outbound. We're going to focus on the last one today. There is very little difference between the middle and the last option. Note that they both are provision managed VNet. So the second two options, provision managed VNet, and I'll go over the differences in a little bit. So that's the network, the most important tab here from a network perspective. And be aware, I have the links in the FAQ, but be aware that there are some differences between AI Studio. So this is the AI Studio networking link, and then there is a managed machine learning studio networking. There are subtle differences between the two. The biggest being that in the AI Studio, currently we do not support bring your own VNet. Okay, so these are the two available, publicly available links, and I will go into the details of AI Studio networking. Okay, so with that, let me bring you back to this screen here. So let's look at the first scenario with public networking. As you could see, the public networking over over here. So how does the traffic flow when we have public networking enabled? So let's take a look. So there are two, oops, it's missing. There are two different flows that I have shown in. The green flow is this external user coming, can access the AI Studio publicly. Again, this is with the first setting. And then remember that when we talk outbound from AI Studio, it is always from the perspective of the compute. And as you know, compute is needed to run prompt flow that Rachel showed earlier, and any other like creating an index. So we do need the compute, and this outbound flow is from the perspective of the compute. And in a very, very simple scenario, mostly for POC and a quick a use case for AI Studio, what we would do is from this, we would deploy to web app. So web app could be in a customer's PaaS. And the way the flow would work is this external user will connect to the web app. The web app can in turn talk to the AI Studio API endpoint and also the AI search that Mike was referring to, Mike Shelton was referring to earlier. So very, very simple. There is no private endpoints yet. So now let's dive into the second option. So I'll turn off these layers. And let's dive into the second option. So this is the more enterprise friendly option where we do private with approved outbound. I have shared, and I took this screen capture from our public documentation. If you have this Draw.io and click on it, it would take you right to where I took this screen capture from. But basically, it's showing the differences between the middle option and the last option. The biggest difference is that the last option use private endpoints to access Azure resources, and in this option, you would incur some costs for FQDN outbound rules. It provisions a firewall behind the scenes, and I'll go into the details. But they're very similar. The only difference, like I said, is it forces you to use private endpoints for outbound. All right, so now let's look at how the flows will work with the private with approved outbound. So imagine that you provisioned the AI Studio with the last option. The first thing you want to do is you want to, because this is not reachable, it's no longer reachable from outside, you want to project two private endpoints in the customer's VNet. All right. So then the way the flow will work, of course, there is no private endpoint discussion complete without DNS. So behind the scenes, when you provision private endpoints, and if you choose the right options, it will provision DNS zones. I have listed the DNS corresponding DNS zones that get provisioned. And the way the flow would work is that this user sitting, in a subnet in Azure can access the studio using the private endpoint. Now, how would it work for the on-prem user sitting over here? There are some DNS implications. I did a deep dive in my previous series on private endpoint and DNS. Daniel has some amazing blogs on that content as well, so be sure to check that out. It is in our FAQ. But under the hood, the way it works is we have two different options. Be sure that you have DNS set up correctly for this to work from on-prem. We have two different methods. One is the classic IaaS-based, setup for hybrid DNS, and then we also offer the private DNS resolver, which is the PaaS-based service in Azure. There's a deep dive videos on those as well. So let's turn off custom DNS for now. And let me add the compute layer. So note that a very important note in here, and when I did this first time, I did not realize that. But when you provision this last option, it provision the private endpoint until you provision the compute. So the moment you provision the compute, a managed VNet gets spun up behind the scene. You have no access to the managed VNet. But when you provision the compute, the private endpoints for all of these PaaS services get projected in the managed VNet. Now, remember, this is different from projecting these two, the Machine Learning Studio and API Studio endpoints in customers VNet. So those were for this user to access the machine learning or AI Studio, and these private endpoints are for compute to access the PaaS services. Okay, so lots of private endpoints here. And then last but not the least, I would project these two private endpoints into the managed VNet. So the blue lines are showing the customer's PaaS services are also projected in the managed VNet. So now let's look at how the prompt flow will work. So Melody demoed the prompt flow, Rachel demoed the prompt flow earlier, but for prompt flow to work in a private environment, we need to ensure that all of these private endpoints are in place. So if you're using AI search, they need to be projected here. And of course, if this API endpoint also needs to be projected in here. So these are the three flows that are required for prompt flow to be successful. And last, I'm going to show you one more flow, which is outbound. So remember, outbound is from the perspective of the compute. With this last option, if your compute needs to go outbound, and it could be for various use cases. For example, if you need access to some machine learning packages like anaconda.com or some other models at docker.io, you need to create FQDN-based rules in Azure, in the AI Studio. When you do that, behind the scenes, it provisions an Azure firewall, so there's cost implications. You wouldn't see the firewall in your subscription, but you will get charged for it. So just be aware of that outbound FQDN rule implications and with the firewall. Like I mentioned earlier, there are certain differences between ML Studio and AI Studio. AI Studio only supports managed VNet. You cannot do your own VNet with it. Quick time check here. Okay, and let me turn off these layers. I want to share one additional scenario. So remember how I showed you the web app earlier with public access. Now, let's say that we have a web app and everything, all of our PaaS services are private. How does it work with that? Mike's going to go into a lot of details. I don't want to steal his thunder, but I want to help you visualize, how this is all flowing. So what will happen is the first thing that needs to happen is that the web app needs to be VNet integrated. In other words, it needs to be able to talk to the resources in the VNet. And then we need to project these two endpoints, the AI search and AI storage, into the customer's VNet. Of course, anytime you project private endpoints, you have to think of um, DNS integration. And then, so those are the DNS zones that get provisioned. And then there's this optional shared private access element as well that you need to enable between the two. And then the flow, the way the flows would work is, of course, this external user would have no access to any of the PaaS services, all the red flows indicating no public access. So the external user will talk to the web app, which is VNet integrated, which will in turn talk to the private endpoints. All right, so that's how this whole flow would work. Let me just do a quick check on anything else I would like to review with everyone. No, I think that sets the stage for Mike, who's going to go into the sample web app. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. And I hope you enjoyed this session so far.